We'll bomb the shit out of them. Those were the words of the President of the United States, spoken not about a terrorist group, not about a hostile military power, but about a small, quiet nation on the edge of the Arabian Peninsula that has not fired a single shot in anger in over half a century. A nation whose entire reputation, built over decades, is that of a peacemaker. A place where enemies go to talk instead of fight. So why would the leader of the most powerful military machine on earth turn his fury toward a country that has spent generations trying to stay out of exactly this kind of war? What did Oman actually do to end up in the crosshairs of an American president already fighting one war in the Middle East and now threatening to open a second front against the one country that has tried hardest to prevent it? To understand how we got here, you have to go back further than this week, further than this month, and look at what Oman has always been and why that identity is now on a collision course with a president who does not appear to believe in quiet diplomacy anymore. For most of the world, Oman barely registers as a headline. It does not dominate the news cycle the way Iran does, or Israel, or Saudi Arabia. It sits on the southeastern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, bordering the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet, the passage through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves every single day. And yet, despite sitting right next to one of the most volatile choke points on Earth, Oman has built its entire modern identity around not being volatile at all. While its neighbors picked sides, armed proxies, and fought open or shadow wars against each other, Oman positioned itself as the region's back channel, the place where secret negotiations happen. The country both the United States and Iran have trusted at different points to carry messages neither side would say to the other directly. This is not a reputation Oman stumbled into. It is a deliberate strategy, decades in the making, built by a country that understood something its neighbors often forgot, that in a region defined by proxy wars and shifting alliances, the most valuable position is not to be the strongest military power, but to be the one country everyone can still talk to. Oman maintained relations with Iran even when the Gulf Arab states cut ties. It hosted secret talks between American and Iranian officials that laid the groundwork for previous nuclear negotiations, channels that would never have existed if either side believed Oman was secretly working against them. It positioned itself as neutral ground in a region that has almost no neutral ground left. That neutrality is not just diplomatic theater. It is the reason Oman has survived, largely untouched, while war has repeatedly swept through its neighbors. Yemen collapsed into a brutal civil war on Oman's southwestern border. Iran and its regional rivals have fought proxy conflicts across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen for years. Israel and Iran have exchanged direct strikes. The United States has bombed targets inside Iran. Through all of it, Oman has remained the exception, the country that talks to everyone and fights no one. It has leaned into that identity so completely that it has become, in a very real sense, Oman's entire foreign policy. Stay out of the fighting, stay useful to everyone, stay necessary. So when the current war between the United States and Iran began escalating, Oman did what it has always done. It positioned itself as the mediator. Alongside Qatar, Omani officials worked to keep back channels open between Washington and Tehran, even as missiles were flying and tankers were burning in the Strait of Hormuz. When a memorandum of understanding was eventually reached to pause the direct fighting between the United States and Iran, Oman was one of the nations working behind the scenes to make that pause possible. It was not the loudest actor in the room. It rarely is. But it was, by most accounts, one of the most important ones, quietly pushing both sides toward a deal that neither fully trusted, but both were willing to accept, at least for a little while. That deal was never going to last forever. It was built on a fragile foundation from the start, a temporary pause between two sides that fundamentally disagreed on what the endgame should look like. But when it collapsed, and when the fighting showed signs of resuming, the question became, who would be blamed for the failure? And in a war this complicated, blame rarely lands only on the two sides doing the actual fighting. It lands on the mediators too, the ones who tried to hold the peace together and failed, or the ones who are seen as standing in the way of a resolution that one side desperately wants. This is the position Oman now finds itself in. Not a combatant, not a target in any traditional military sense, but a nation suddenly named directly by an American president threatening violence, not against Iran, but against the country that has spent this entire war trying to prevent exactly the kind of escalation Trump now seems ready to pursue. The obvious question is why? Why would Trump threaten Oman specifically? What did Oman do or refuse to do that put it in his line of fire? Was it something said behind closed doors? Was it a decision Oman made or a decision it refused to make? Was this threat really about Oman at all, or was Oman simply the nearest available target for a warning meant for someone else entirely? That question does not have a simple answer yet, and it will not have one until we look closely at exactly what has happened in the days leading up to this threat, what deadline just expired, and what is really at stake in the waters Oman sits beside. Because to understand why Trump pointed at Oman, you first have to understand what just fell apart, and why its collapse left everyone in the region bracing for what comes next. The deal that just collapsed was never meant to last forever, but almost no one expected it to fall apart quite this fast, or quite this publicly. To understand what broke, you have to understand what it actually was in the first place, because this was not a peace treaty. It was not a ceasefire in the way most people imagine one, with formal signatures and mutual guarantees stretching years into the future. It was something far more fragile, a memorandum of understanding, a temporary arrangement between two sides that did not trust each other, built to buy time rather than end a war. The memorandum emerged after weeks of direct fighting between the United States and Iran, fighting that had pulled in Israel, threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and put American citizens across the Middle East on edge. Mediators from Qatar and Oman worked urgently behind the scenes to bring both sides to something resembling a pause. The arrangement that emerged was narrow and specific. Iran wanted an agreement where it remained dominant over its own waters, controlling the security, the demining operations, and the maritime services in and around the strait. It was described by Iranian negotiators as a deal meant to last somewhere between 1 and 3 months, not a permanent resolution, but breathing room. Time for both sides to step back from the edge without either one claiming defeat. For a brief window, it seemed to work. The direct fighting paused. Oil tankers that had been targeted in previous weeks were no longer under immediate threat, at least not from direct American or Iranian strikes. Diplomats spoke cautiously of progress, but underneath that surface calm, almost nothing had actually been resolved. The core disagreements that started the war in the first place, Iran's nuclear program, the American military presence in the region, the question of who ultimately controls access to Hormuz, none of it had been settled. The memorandum did not fix the war, it froze it, and everyone involved knew the freeze had an expiration date. That expiration date arrived, and when it did, neither side showed any real willingness to extend it. Iran's foreign minister stated plainly that no decision had been made to restart negotiations with the United States. It was a message delivered not through official diplomatic channels, but through a social media post. A small detail that says a great deal about how far trust between the two sides had eroded. This was not the language of two nations working toward peace. It was two nations publicly signaling that neither one felt obligated to be the one who reached out first. Behind the scenes, mediators from Qatar and Pakistan continued exchanging messages with Iranian officials, trying to keep some thread of diplomacy alive, even as the public deadline passed without renewal. But the momentum had shifted. For weeks, both the United States and Iran had accused each other of violating the terms of the agreement, each side pointing to the other as the reason trust had broken down. Whether those accusations were fully accurate almost did not matter anymore. What mattered was that both governments now had a ready-made justification for walking away, a narrative they could each tell their own populations about why the other side was to blame. This is often how fragile ceasefires actually die, not with a single dramatic betrayal, but with a slow accumulation of accusations, missed deadlines, and public statements that each side can later point to as proof they were never really the problem. By the time the memorandum formally expired, it had already been weakened for weeks by mutual distrust. Its expiration was less a sudden collapse and more the final confirmation of something that had been failing quietly for a long time. And it was in this exact moment, in the hours after the deadline passed with no clear path back to negotiations, that Trump made his threat toward Oman. Not toward Iran directly, not a new declaration of war. A warning aimed at the mediator, the country that had spent this entire fragile peace process trying to hold the arrangement together. On the surface, this seems like a strange choice. If the deal collapsed because of disagreements between Washington and Tehran, why direct anger toward Muscat? But wars rarely follow the logic of the two sides most visibly fighting them. Sometimes the pressure gets redirected toward whoever still has leverage left to apply. And in this moment, Oman may have been exactly that. Because while the ceasefire was falling apart on the diplomatic level, something else was happening in the waters both nations had been fighting over the entire time. The Strait of Hormuz never stopped being the center of gravity in this conflict. And in the days surrounding the memorandum's collapse, it became the stage for exactly the kind of confrontation that turns a diplomatic failure into something far more dangerous. Trump's declaration that the United States would soon treat Hormuz as though it were American territory did not come out of nowhere. It came after Iran had effectively closed the strait through military pressure, after tankers had already come under attack, after satellite images showed oil slicks spreading off the coast near Hengam Island, evidence of exactly the kind of damage that happens when a critical shipping lane becomes a battlefield instead of a trade route. Iran, for its part, was not backing down either. Iranian military advisors spoke openly about the possibility of prolonging the war for as long as it took, even suggesting the conflict could stretch until Trump himself was out of office, a signal that Tehran was preparing for a long fight rather than a quick resolution. It was in this atmosphere, tankers burning, satellite images circulating, both sides publicly preparing for the war to continue rather than end, that Trump's threat toward Oman landed. And that timing raises the real question at the heart of this story. Was this threat actually about Oman failing as a mediator? Or was Oman simply standing in the way of something much bigger, an American push to claim direct control over the strait itself, regardless of what any negotiated agreement said? To answer that, we have to look closely at what Trump actually claimed about Hormuz, tell them exactly how far the United States is willing to go to assert control over this region, and what that means for their own position if they end up standing in Washington's way next. This is why the threat against Oman matters far more than 4 words spoken in a television interview should. It is not really a story about whether the United States bombs Oman. It may never come to that. It is a story about what that threat reveals, that the war between the United States and Iran was never only about Iran, that the real prize underneath this entire conflict has always been control of the Strait of Hormuz itself, and that any nation, ally or neutral party, historic mediator or otherwise, now risks becoming collateral in that pursuit if it stands even quietly in the way. Oman spent decades building a reputation as the one country in this region that everyone could trust precisely because it never had to be feared. That reputation kept it safe through wars that consumed its neighbors. But in this moment, for the first time in a generation, Oman finds itself facing a question it has never really had to answer before. What happens when neutrality itself becomes a thing a great power can no longer tolerate? The answer to that question will not just determine Oman's future, it may determine whether this war finally breaks its banks and becomes the second war this region has been bracing for since the moment the first shots were fired.